Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Meet the Candidates. I'm your host, Jonathan Grabowski. It is fall 2022 election season, and joining me as a candidate running for district attorney, it's Rahsaan Hall. Rahsaan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, John.
Great. So we're going to talk about a wide variety of items here on the show today, but first off, for those that don't know, who is Rahsaan Hall?
So I am a civil rights attorney, an ordained reverend, and I used to be a prosecutor in Suffolk County for 8 years, where I handled any number of gun, drug, homicide, gang cases. I live in Brockton with my wife and family, and I'm running to reclaim the spirit of justice. I've seen too many injustices in the criminal legal system, and I think it's time for a change here in Plymouth County. So
you're a former 8A in Suffolk County. Talk about the items you worked on there.
Sure. So I started out in Dorchester District Court, handling any number of run-of-the-mill motor vehicle offenses, domestic violence cases, and not to dismiss the significance of some of the cases that included violence, drug sales, gun arrests. Then I was promoted to Superior Court, where I was the point prosecutor for the Safe Neighborhood Initiative, specifically focusing on a section of Dorchester called Upham's Corner. It was tantamount to the gang unit, where we worked directly with the police department in that area to intervene in gang and drug activity. And then ultimately promoted to the senior trial unit, where I handled complex litigation matters and homicide cases.
Great. So why have you decided to run for Plymouth County District Attorney?
Well, again, I see the need for change here in Plymouth County and in the system as a whole. Prior to running for district attorney, I worked at the ACLU of Massachusetts, where I ran a public education campaign called What a Difference a DA Makes, to educate the public on the role, power, and influence of district attorneys, because most people don't know what it is district attorneys do. And in doing that work, in the lead up to the 2018 election and continuing it over the last 4 years, I came across so many people who, when they found out what it was that district attorneys did, had a desire to see the office run differently, particularly here in Plymouth County. As a resident of Brockton, seeing some of the injustices that people are facing, the racial disparities that exist, but also through other parts of the county, in Plymouth, in Marshfield, in Scituate, in the Bridgewaters, having conversations about how this system can operate differently and better for everyone, regardless of where they live, regardless of how much money they make, and regardless of the color of their skin. And so that's what influenced this decision for me.
So what are some things that you can take from your career and apply it to the DA position?
I think one of the things that's the most significant, and I get this both from my role as an assistant district attorney, as well as a civil rights attorney, and as an ordained reverend who has to minister to families who have been on both sides of the system, is that connecting with people is so important. The times that I sat with the families of murder victims, helping them understand this system that is so cold and sterile, and navigating them through the process, even after getting the conviction. The conversations that I've had with people who have been victims of discrimination or police misconduct gives me an insight and perspective on some of the ways that the systems can be harmful to people. I think my ability to collaborate and work collectively with people is something that is important. It's important. It has been important to my career, but it's also important to the role that I want to play as district attorney. Not want to play, but the role that I seek to execute as district attorney.
We always like to do a little Civics 101 here on the
Sure.
show. So what's the role of the district attorney?
Primarily, the role of the district attorney is to be a minister of justice. By that, I mean that they are responsible for the prosecution of criminal cases, whether it's a case that's brought forward by police officers or other law enforcement agencies, or if it's a case that the district attorney investigates along with the law enforcement agencies and presents to a grand jury. But it's not just about seeking convictions, it's about making sure that justice is done. So if there is evidence that tends to exculpate or prove someone's innocence, the prosecutor has a role to play in turning that over to make sure that justice is done. For the people who claim to love the Constitution, we've got to abide by the Constitution, and those protections are put in place. We also have to be mindful of protecting people in community and holding people accountable, but it can be done in ways that are less harsh and get better outcomes for our communities, where we don't have people continuing to cycle through the system. Secondly, I think the district attorney's responsibility is to work collaboratively with community organizations to identify ways to help people who are in need of assistance or services or treatment. And then third, using that influence before the legislature. Traditionally, district attorneys have prioritized advocating on behalf of further criminalization of certain conduct, but have opposed progressive reforms in the past. And so those are some of the ways that I see the role of district attorney.
So every electoral race kind of has that one hot button issue, I guess you would say. What is it in the DA's race?
From my perspective in the DA's race, it's the wrongful convictions and the miscarriages of justice that exist in this office. I think it's important for people to recognize that this office has prosecuted people who did not deserve to be prosecuted and wasted taxpayer resources and dollars on trying those cases to either have them dismissed or have people acquitted. It's not a good use of our precious resources as taxpayers.
So you have a fantastic website, so I pulled a lot of stuff off of that we'll get into. So on your website, you talk about your policy platform. And what does it mean when you talk about creating a public system that prioritizes restoration, transformation, and healing?
One of the things that the criminal legal system has done over the years has punished people, but it has done very little to hold people accountable. It's one thing for a person to sit in a cage. The reality is that 96% of the people who are incarcerated are coming home one day. And when they're coming home after being, well, let me say this, the four drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's needs. We send people who we punish to a place where they are shamed, isolated, exposed to violence, and have an inability to meet their needs. And I understand the desire to keep people safe and restrain people who are violent. But 96% of people who are incarcerated are coming home one day. And how can we better serve our communities and keep our communities safe with the system that we have? Or are there other alternatives that we can invest in while still keeping communities safe, while still restraining the people who are a threat to our communities, but investing in addressing some of the underlying needs like substance use disorder or mental health issues or poverty or exposure to trauma and violence? Those are the things that I'm talking about addressing, and there's a role for the district attorney's office to play in that.
So you have a bunch of values on your website, and I want to get into those. So first off, community engagement. How do you envision what that would look like, and who would you partner with? Are there groups that you think this is important for us to partner with?
Right. I think there are a lot of groups, and Plymouth County is a very large county. There's 27 municipalities, and I think one way to approach this is looking at the district courts in Brockton, Plymouth, Hingham, and Wareham. And each of those courts has a jurisdiction, or the towns that feed into those courts. Developing, regional, for the sake of a better, lack of a better term, regional advisory committees and community advisory boards. So it's not just always law enforcement at the table with the DA's office, but it's residents, it's community watch groups. It's also groups that are working on reentry, or groups that are working with substance use disorder or mental health issues. So groups like Situate Facts, or a group like Brockton Interfaith Communities. Those are some of the groups that are important to bring to the table. The Brockton branch NAACP. These groups have their finger on the pulse of what's going on in the communities, the Cape Verdean associations. And so these partnering with them, but also using their relationships and connections in community to share information about what's happening in the DA's office and within the criminal legal system.
Define what transparency means for the office of the district attorney.
The residents of Plymouth County deserve to know what's being said and done in our names and on our tax dollars. And so I think the things that are important for them to be able to have access to are what the office's policies are. There are a lot of concerns that people have about the criminal legal system, whether it's related to bail or sentencing recommendations or mandatory minimums or wrongful convictions. What are the office's policies on those things? I think that should be left on the website. I think the data and the statistics of what the DA's office is doing, how many cases are being prosecuted, what are the racial demographics of the cases that are being prosecuted, what are some of the outcomes. You know, we're not providing people's personally identifiable information, but we're talking about general information about the prosecution statistics, and it should be accessible not only to the public but to researchers where they can download it and access it and analyze it. And so those are some of the things. I mean, one of the things that's a concern to me is when I was at the ACLU, we had to sue the district attorney's office to get public records filled from them because we sent records requests to all 11 district attorneys' offices, and all 10 out of the 11 gave us those records except one, Plymouth County. They said it would cost $1.2 million to fulfill that public records request. And then when we sued, they turned around and hired a high-priced lawyer on taxpayer dollars and ended up giving us those records for free. So transparency obviates the need for those types of lawsuits and the use of taxpayer dollars.
So another one is harm reduction in regards to substance use and mental health, which you've kind of touched on. What does it mean to be more restorative and transformative in dealing with those individuals facing those challenges? Right.
The opioid crisis has decimated so many communities and has caused so much harm. And our understanding of how to address those issues has changed over time. We've learned from the failed war on drugs that decimated Black and brown communities and poor communities that we can't take a hardcore criminalization approach, but that we need to take a public health approach to addressing those issues. And so making sure that people who are struggling with substance use disorder are getting access to treatment and having their needs met in other ways. And so sometimes that means diverting them out of the system and not prosecuting those cases, but connecting them with service providers or therapy. Those are some of the things that I think are going to be more restorative instead of forcing someone to detox cold turkey by incarcerating them.
We've used the word restorative a few times, and restorative justice is a phrase that we hear a lot in society now. What's your definition of what it means?
Restorative justice is a victim-centered offender accountability process that holds an offender to account in community and addresses the needs of the person who has been victimized by discussing the harm and making the offender accountable to the harm. Traditionally, people have understood accountability to mean a person going to jail. But again, to my earlier point, sitting in a cage doesn't necessarily make sure that that person returns to society any better than they are. I've been a part of restorative justice practices. I've sat in prison with the men that I sent to prison as a prosecutor and been engaged in restorative justice processes and seen how their perspective and their understanding about the harm that they've caused has changed. And it's a function of being engaged in dialogue, not only with the victim or a stand-in for the victim, but the community. And that's what helps us get better outcomes. Hurt people. So we need to make sure that to undo that, instead of putting harm out into the world, they know and understand how to put healing out into the world. And those restorative justice processes can work at varying degrees of severity of the crime level, but it's victim-centered.
Cash bail is a topic, I think, in every DA's race from here to California. So what are your thoughts on it, and would you change it if elected?
Yeah, so the district attorney doesn't have the power to change the bail statute. And the purpose of bail is to ensure that people return to court the next day. Right. The common understanding that a lot of people have is if somebody is arrested for a crime, despite the fact that they are presumed innocent until proven guilty, that they should be held. The reality is statute provides a release on a person's recognizance unless there is some concern that suggests they will not return to court on the next court date. There's a separate proceeding if someone is a danger to the community. They have dangerousness hearings to make sure that they're held. To the extent that a cash bail is a way of ensuring a person returns to court the next day, the problem is that poor people are the ones who end up bearing the burden of that, where if someone is wealthy, they can post that bail and go about their lives. There's also a significant racial disparity in who ends up being held on a cash bail and who doesn't. And so under my administration, I wouldn't seek cash bail in low-level nonviolent cases or cases where we're not seeking any form of incarceration, unless there's some clear evidence that the person is not going to return to court on the next day, aside from a fear or a hunch that the person is going to abscond.
So certain low-level offenses, if you talked about maybe declining prosecution when they are a threat to public safety, what low-level offenses would these consist of? Right.
When we think about our courts and the level of backlog that exists in our courts, 20% of the charges that are filed in the Commonwealth each year, and including in Plymouth County, are motor vehicle offenses. Okay. So that's something to look at. And here's the other thing about a decline to prosecute policy. It is a presumptive non-prosecution, meaning the default position is going to be not to prosecute, but there may be instances where it is justified and required to prosecute a certain offense. And there'll be a process to make sure that happens. But the reality is that in a lot of these cases that end up being dismissed anyway. I know that from my own experience as a prosecutor, and research shows that people who in the first instance have cases dismissed or are diverted out of the court are less likely to come back. And so if people are concerned about recidivism, we want to do the things that the evidence and the research shows reduces recidivism. And so these cases that don't present a threat to public safety are the cases that we can clear out. We can focus our resources on the cases that present a real legitimate threat to public safety.
Great. So if you were elected as DA, how would you in the office serve as a resource to victims of all crime?
So the primary interaction that victims of crime have with the DA's office is usually through the victim witness advocates. And so making sure that the victim witness advocates are well trained, culturally competent, have access to referrals and resources, because there are many instances, particularly in sexual assault cases and child abuse cases, where there are evidentiary barriers to proceeding with a case. But that doesn't mean that we should not care for the person who has been victimized or try to find resources that help bring about healing. We've placed our trust and reliance in this system to bring about justice and accountability. But when the system isn't equipped to deal with that, or again, there are evidentiary barriers, what are the things that this office can do to make sure people's needs are being met? And so one of those things is ensuring that the victim witness advocate staff is well trained, well resourced, and culturally competent, reflects the communities that are being serviced by the office, but also partnering with organizations, community organizations that provide support and resources to victims and survivors of crime.
Yeah, I was going to follow up asking what you meant by culturally competent.
Yeah, and so when you have somebody who speaks Cape Verdean Creole, you want to have a victim witness advocate that does that. When you have someone who speaks Haitian Creole or Vietnamese, language competency, but also people who are Native American or First Nation people, having an appreciation for what it's like to live their life. Yeah, and so I think, and that comes through diversifying the office and the staff, but also being engaged in trainings to help people understand that the way that they have lived their life may not necessarily resonate with someone who is a victim, and so recognizing those points of potential conflict.
So something interesting that you have proposed is an integrity and justice unit. What would the role of that unit be?
So there are currently a lot of district attorneys' offices that have conviction integrity units, and that has primarily been focused on looking at wrongful convictions or claims of innocence. My vision for the integrity and justice unit, or an integrity review bureau, would be to have the ability to look at every aspect along the trajectory of the life of a case. Not every case, but to have auditing ability of our own cases and do spot checks to make sure that the the processes that the assistant district attorneys are following are in line with the policies of the office, and taking that information and feeding it back into the training that we're doing. There are certain practices that disproportionately lead to wrongful convictions. We want to make sure that we're evaluating cases to see that those things aren't happening. We want to be able to look at some of the cases that have significant consequences, like homicide cases, and make sure that the preparation of the case is up to a certain level. And then within that unit, there would be an autonomous body that would be looking specifically at cases of police misconduct or police involved shootings, because it's important for the public to have trust in the office, particularly in poorer communities and communities of color where there's been a history of distrust. And so to the extent that the office can have a unit that deals with these things in a way that is perceived by the community as fair and impartial, I think that helps increase the level of public trust in the office.
So talk about some of the advocacy work, the DA's office would do if you were elected.
I think there are a lot of community-based programs that are doing really great advocacy, particularly when it comes to young people who are engaged in risky behavior or being exposed to gang activity, looking at, again, the work of people who are doing recovery and substance use prevention work. The DA's office can't do all of the things, right? And so helping to marshal resources, whether it's at the state legislature advocating for appropriations for those organizations, or co-applying for grants with organizations to make sure that they're getting the funding so we can get more people connected to services. And then lastly, I think advocating before the legislature. One of the things that I found most impressive is seeing a district attorney show up to testify in support of the Promise Act back in 2018. Which was the act to make sure that public education funding was well funding, because that district attorney knew that the more young people who received a higher quality education meant the fewer people that would ultimately end up being prosecuted by the DA's office.
So if elected, what's one or two big priorities?
So the priorities are from the outset making sure that there are clear, well-established policies for the office that all of the assistant district attorneys would follow and that it's publicly available, but also that there is comprehensive training to make sure that all of the assistant district attorneys who are coming through that office are well trained. I've spoken to several former ADAs from this county or former prosecutors from this county's office, and they've raised concerns about the lack of training there. The other thing would be the collection, analysis, and reporting of data. Granted, the district attorney's offices across the Commonwealth have an outdated case management system, but that shouldn't be an excuse, because we look at the Middlesex DA's office and the Suffolk DA's office, they're both collecting data and reporting and sharing out that data. We should be doing that too. And lastly, the creation of this Integrity Review Bureau that would begin to analyze and evaluate the cases and make sure that they're at a higher level and that there's greater integrity in the prosecution of criminal cases.
Excellent. So we're on the home stretch here, so we always like to try to have a little fun, because
Sure.
a lot of times with, a lot of elections we get into really deep, tough issues. So we're going to start off with some fun. So what's a Rahsaan Hall fun fact?
Rahsaan Hall fun fact is that when I was a child, I taught myself to juggle.
Wow. I think you might be the second candidate we've had on that's mentioned juggling as a
Really?
fun fact, which
Okay.
is interesting. We've never had that. So in the movie about your life, who plays you?
Idris Elba. or Denzel.
I think that's the quickest answer I've received so far this season. Usually that's the toughest question candidates have. If people want to find out more about you, where can they go?
Folks should go to our campaign website, hall4da.com. That's hall, the number 4, da.com.
And last but certainly not least, why are you the best candidate for this position?
I'm the best candidate for this position because of my lived experience as a civil rights attorney, as a prosecutor, and as an ordained reverend. I know the pain that families have felt and sat with them in these serious cases that they've dealt with. I've seen the injustices that this system has done, as well as some of the positive outcomes that have come out of it. And I'm the one who's going to bring a level of integrity and professionalism to this office to make sure that regardless of where you live, regardless of how much money you make, or regardless of the color of your skin or the language that you speak, that this office is going to treat you fairly and that there will be justice for everyone in Plymouth County.
Great. Well, Rahsaan, I want to thank you for joining us today on the show and wish you the best of luck in this always interesting campaign season.
Yeah, thank you, and I hope to earn everyone's vote. I humbly ask for it on or before November 8th.
And that's all the time we have for Meet the Candidates, and until next time, make it a great day.